Hey everybody, so I was making this scene of the Rainbow Room from a Netflix show called Stranger Things. You might have seen it. And one of the most important games in this room was this plinko board. And there's many scenes of Eleven, the main character in the show, playing with this board. So I really wanted it in the scene and not just to have it kind of sit there, but really have one of the red discs things or pucks or whatever they are falling down through the pegs all the way down to the bottom in a really believable way. So I started animating that and I quickly realized how insane that was and how much work that was. And it would have never really looked that good. So I'm going to rebuild this whole board for you and show you how this works using rigid body dynamics, which is what I use to make this effect. So anytime you're working with Blender's physics system, there's going to be some trial and error and some experimentation, but in the end, I think the result was pretty good. I think it's worth the work and the trouble to do that. So I want to show you how I did that. So let's get into it. All right, here we are with a brand new Blender file. I'm going to get rid of this default cube and add in a plane. And we'll scale this up on the Y, rotate it so it's vertical. And this is going to be the start of our board. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this modeling because I want to get to the relevant part, which is the physics part. But yeah, I kind of just want to show you how the pieces of this board come together and how they all interact with each other in the physics world. Yeah, so we'll take this, just extrude this out a little bit. I'm going to get rid of these faces, and this is going to be the kind of the frame of the plinko board. I'm just going to bevel this a little bit like that, and we'll shade that smooth. And we'll probably turn on auto smooth for that. And this should have some thickness, so I think I'm gonna just add a solidify modifier in there, bring that in something about like that. And I'm gonna apply that right away and then steal a little bit of this back geometry. I'm gonna hit Control D or Shift D rather and bring that out on the Y and then separate that. And then go into edit mode here, fill that in. This is going to be the back of the board. So I'm going to move this just in like that. I'm going to check my normals. Normals look good. Okay, so this is the basic frame of the board. And then I want the pegs to kind of all be in like this, but then staggered a little bit like that. So it'll give the disc kind of like these possible pathways that it can go down and then find its way into a slot in the bottom of the board. So, all right, so that's our peg. We can shade smooth that and auto smooth as well. Okay, that might be a little bit big for a peg, but we'll see what we have as we go. So, okay, so I need to duplicate this and create that pattern like I said before. So easiest way to do that is with an array, and I like the constant offset rather than the relative, because if you change the shape of the mesh, it then affects the distance between the iterations in the array if they're relative. So I like to keep them constant so that's not disturbed if I edit the mesh. So we need these things a little bit closer together, and I think 4 to start will be good. So let me space these out something around like that, and then we'll add another array. Duplicate that down, and instead of along the X, I want these along the Z axis like so. So that'll be our rows of 4 pegs. I'm going to duplicate that with Shift D, move it down in the Z direction so it's roughly in the middle, and then just offset this a little bit like that. And then we need one more along the X direction array, and then we'll take one less off of the Z. Okay, that's coming together okay. And then as the disks come along these different possible pathways, they kind of settle into one of these slots at the bottom. So we'll need those slot things. So I think we'll just start with a cube, scale that down, bring this down to the bottom, and scale that in like this. Okay, I think that's about, actually that should be probably a little bit taller than that. And then we'll bevel the front of that a bit, shade that smooth and tick on auto smooth. And I want 4 of these. So we'll hit that with another array along the X. And we'll need 4 of those. Okay, so that's good. So this is the basic setup for our pegboard. Okay, so now let's talk physics. So in Blender, there's several different different physics systems. The one we're going to be dealing with is rigid body, and it's called rigid body because it deals with objects colliding with one another in a world where there's gravity, kind of in the world that we live in. But these objects that are being affected by Blender's physics engine they're not being deformed, right? They're rigid. They're not gonna, their shape is not gonna change, and that's what we want here. So this disk is going to be bouncing down along these different pathways and kind of running into these pegs and then falling into one of these slots. So nothing's being deformed or the mesh is not changing its shape. So rigid body is the one that we want. There's other kinds of physics systems. There's fluid physics. There's a whole cloth system. There's a whole different array of forces that we can have acting on different things. There's soft body physics. We don't want any of that. We just want the rigid body physics. So that's what we're going to be using. And within rigid body dynamics, there's basically 2 classes of objects that you can have. These are passive and active. Passive objects are being considered in the rigid body world, but they're not being animated. They're just static objects. Things can run into them, right? So they can be collided with. So they affect objects in that sense, but they're really not moving, and gravity's not acting on them. They're not being animated. So most of our objects are going to be passive because the disk is going to be running into things, and its trajectory and its path is going to be affected by those things. But they themselves are not being animated. The only thing that's going to have an active rigid body dynamic to it is going to be the round disk itself. So let's draw that in here quickly. So let's add a circle, fill that in, rotate it on the X so it faces us. And I think that might be a little bit too big, so we'll take that down a little bit, extrude that out, and we'll take these edges, let's bevel these, why not? So give that a nice little bevel. Okay, and throw a subdivision on it too, why not? And we'll shade smooth that. So that's our disk. Okay, so this is going to be moving down these across these pegs, or running into these pegs rather, and kind of finding a pathway. And we just need to make sure that the disk is small enough to fit through these paths. So it looks like it is. We might need to change these a little bit later, but let's start with this. So with our disk here, let's start setting some rigid body dynamics to these different objects. So we'll start with the disk itself, and we'll select rigid body from the physics menu, and this is already default to active, so we'll keep it there. Let's keep all this default for now, and let's go to the other pieces of this board. So the frame of the board, the outer frame, we'll want that rigid body, and this needs to be passive, right? Because it may be encountered or collided with when the disk hits it, if it encounters it. So we'll need that in the system, so we'll add that, and we'll keep that passive. We'll talk about the collision shape and the surface response and the sensitivity margins a little bit later, but let's just start with assigning all these things or just getting them into this physics world by enabling the rigid body here. So we'll have this passive because this is the back of the board, and these pegs will also need to be rigid body. These are passive. So we'll assign those, and then the slot things at the bottom. Assign that passive as well. Okay, so let's see what we have. And I think we might need a little bit more than 60 frames. So we'll make this maybe 120 or something. And let's play our simulation. And right now, that's definitely not what we want. The puck just flies off. And yeah, so this is the start of what I was saying before with physics systems being a thing where we need to kind of like mess with different settings and change things so we get the results that we wanted. So this is where that process starts. So why is this flying off into space like this? Well, I think it's because this frame has a shape of convex hull. And this is a theory of mine, but we'll see if we change this to mesh and replay it. Let's see what we got then. Okay, so that's an improvement. Things are going in the right direction. But let me just stop and explain why that made a difference. So these shapes are different primitive shapes for meshes that the rigid body system in Blender can use to make calculations and determine if things are colliding or not. Things like boxes, cylinders, spheres, those are mathematically cheap to calculate, so they're more efficient. Things like convex hull and mesh are more expensive, but they're more accurate. So you might see a performance hit by choosing these, but the calculations are going to be more accurate. Convex hull is kind of like a mesh approximation. So you can think of like something around here that's it's a mesh that it's kind of being shrink wrapped, so to speak, on the object that it's acting on. And normally what this does is it takes the bounding box of an object and basically shrink wraps a mesh around that, and it uses that to make the calculation. So the problem with that is that if we look at this frame if we just look at this in isolation, we see that there's a bunch of empty space here. So things should be able to pass through here. But if we look at the bounding box of this, the bounding box really is, it takes in the whole, it's kind of like this, right? So it's a bad drawing, but I think you know what I mean. This is bounded by a box that if something were to encounter it, it's going to run into this thing and kind of like bounce off because it's being enclosed in a box. So that's what convex hull is doing. So we need to change this to say, I need the actual mesh itself to be what determines if something is colliding with it or not. So that's what we're going to do for the frame. And that solves that. So now it's not just detecting that the disk is already colliding with something and it's just like freaking out and flying out. So we solved that problem. But we have something else. You can see that the disk it's passing straight through a peg. That should be impossible, right? It should be bouncing off this thing. And the reason for that is because we put an array modifier on these different pegs. So this peg that it's basically like passing through as if it wasn't there. It's because this peg isn't, in fact, all these four don't really exist. Only that one does, because that's the one that's the one that the array is applied to. So we need to make these pegs actually exist and make them real. So that's going to involve applying all these different arrays on these pegs. We need to do that for all of these. So now we can see, what I like to do is parent everything to an empty. So we'll add an empty in here. We'll use a cube shape, and we're just going to parent all of this stuff, this, the pegs, the disk, the slots, all of that. We're going to control P that to this empty. So now I have, did that work? What happened? Let's try that again. Select everything, pegs, back, board, and we'll select the empty, and I'll do, so parent, loop in parents. What's happening there? Empty. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this empty. No idea what happened there. Let's start again. Let's add another empty cube, and we'll select all of this, select the cube last, and parent that to that. So now we should have a good parenting relationship there. I have no idea what happened there, but seems to be working now. And then let's look from the side. I'm just going to rotate this parent, something like that. So now, hopefully, as this disc goes down the pegboard, hopefully it'll be resting against the back the entire time, but you never know. So let's try. Let's see what we got. So let's play the animation again. Okay, let's give this some more time. Let's maybe add 150. And then last thing I want to do is I'm just going to offset this a little bit so it has a little bit of a chance to kind of like prefer one side of this peg versus the other, so it doesn't kind of get hung up or caught at the very first moment. So let's play this again. Okay, that's getting there. It's still kind of that doesn't really look real. So let's see, let's look from the side again. Let's see how close this is to the back. So I can see that this is a little bit it's a little bit too close. I'm going to move this just a little bit off of there, just in case it thinks it's colliding at the very start of the animation. So let's do that. Okay, that's not bad. Let's maybe move this down a little bit. Let's see what we got here. Okay, still getting a little crazy. I think what I want to do now is make sure that this disc doesn't, as it goes down, it could just the act of it bumping into things, it could kind of like get off of the board and start going off into space. What I want to do is add kind of like sort of like a glass case to this, so it can't actually escape this system. So I think I'll just take this. Actually, let me reset this rotation so we're dealing with things as they were before, and I'm going to duplicate the back of the board with Shift D along Y and just move it up something like that. So now the disc, if we look inside here, the disc it's in between. There's a little section or space in here that it can live within and won't be able to escape. And to see things a little bit more clearly, I'm going to change the display settings for this front panel, and I'm going to change the viewport display to display as wire. So we won't actually see it, but it's still in the rigid body system, so it'll still be collided against and keep that puck in there, hopefully. And let's look from the side, retilt that back a little bit, and play the animation again. So now it should stay in there a little bit better, which it does. I like that much more. And what's going on here? Did we apply that array? We didn't apply that array. So remember these three meshes here for the bottom slots are not real. Only that one actually exists because it has an array modifier, so we need to apply that. So we'll quickly do that, replay this, and it should find its way in the middle of a slot, which it does. So I think this is looking pretty decent. It's still I don't like the way it kind of hangs on that first peg though. I don't really like that. Let's see if we can make this a little bit bouncier. Here's another concept which is fun to play with, and that's the surface response of different items or different meshes in the rigid body system. You can make these things kind of bouncy and reduce the friction so they don't reduce the velocity when they come into contact. So I'm just gonna maybe increase these, and maybe on the puck as well. We'll make this a little bit more bouncy. Take the friction down a little bit like that. Maybe on the back too. Take the friction down and start again. So that definitely looks a little slippier, doesn't it? But I think it's definitely getting better. Let's see, move that up a little bit. Yeah, it's getting there. Anyway, so that's the idea. You can tweak these and move these around and kind of nudge things and play with these settings. But this is how I built the pegboard. It just saved me a lot of time rather than trying to animate these and make it look real. Um, so yeah, this is a great technique, and just wanted to show everybody how that was done. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.